I really want you to take a second and imagine an empire.
Okay.
And not just, any empire, but one that is so staggeringly powerful, so technologically advanced, that it genuinely terrifies all of its rivals.
Right.
We're talking about an economic juggernaut that has absolutely perfected the art of manufacturing. They dominate global markets. They effectively dictate the pace of human innovation, all of it.
They're essentially untouchable.
Exactly. Untouchable. But now, imagine that at the exact moment of its greatest technological triumph, like in the very peak of its undisputed power, it just completely implodes.
I mean, it sounds like the premise of a crazy sci-fi novel or maybe a history lecture on ancient Rome or something.
Right. But the phenomenon we're actually diving into today happened in our own lifetime. We are looking at the Japanese IT and semiconductor industry.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a massive story.
Because if we rewind the clock back to the 1980s, the Japanese tech sector was an unstoppable force.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone operating in Silicon Valley at that time, they weren't just worried about their market share. They were facing this genuine existential panic.
They were terrified.
Totally terrified.
Yeah.
There were prominent business books and all these policy papers being published in the U.S. that were effectively declaring that Japan was taking over the world.
Right.
Like American manufacturing was permanently obsolete. The Japanese firms were producing the finest memory chips, the most reliable consumer electronics, just the most precision-engineered hardware on the planet.
And, the macroeconomic data from the early to mid-'80s completely supported that consensus.
It wasn't just paranoia.
No, not at all. Japanese firms were out-innovating, out-producing, and basically outselling American firms in almost every critical hardware component of that era.
Yeah.
They had effectively cornered the global market on quality control. Their engineers were just the absolute envy of the industrial world.
But then, the calendar turns to the 1990s. And the 90s, as anyone who lived through it remembers, was arguably the most prosperous, explosive decade for global technology in human history.
Oh, absolutely. The internet boom, personal computing.
Exactly, the birth of modern mobile communications. It was this absolute golden age for tech. And yet, during this exact decade of unprecedented global tech prosperity, Japan's IT giants suffered this avalanche of a collapse.
Yeah, their global market share just evaporated.
Just shattered. And so the mission of our deep dive today is essentially an autopsy of that collapse. Why did the empire fall?
It really remains one of the most profound economic and technological mysteries of the modern era. And to deconstruct what actually happened, we're relying on a landmark study.
Right. Let's talk about the sources.
Yeah, so it's a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper. It's authored by Ashish Arora from Duke University, alongside Lee Branstetter and Matej Drev from Carnegie Mellon. And the title of the paper is Going Soft: How the Rise of Software-Based Innovation Led to the Decline of Japan's IT Industry and the Resurgence of Silicon Valley.
See, that title alone, Going Soft,
Yeah.
it really hints that this isn't just some dry academic ledger of profits and losses.
No, it's really not.
The researchers have effectively conducted a forensic audit of a fallen tech empire. We're going to examine what they identify as this invisible gravity that completely shifted the center of global tech dominance away from Japan and back to the U.S.
And I think the most counterintuitive finding of this entire study needs to be established right up front.
Okay, lay it on us.
The Japanese tech empire did not fail because its workforce became complacent.
Right, they didn't just get lazy.
Exactly. They didn't stop investing in research. They didn't lose their famous work ethic. The data actually reveals a far more, unsettling reality.
Which is?
They failed because they tried entirely too hard at the wrong game.
Oh, wow.
The harder they worked and the more capital they deployed, the faster they actually accelerated their own demise.
That concept is so fascinating. Like, if I'm following the logic here, it's as if you are the undisputed world champion at chess.
Okay, I like this.
You've spent decades obsessively perfecting your openings, your mid-game tactics, your end games. You're mathematically unbeatable on a chessboard.
Right.
But while you were locked in your training facility perfecting those chess skills, the rest of the world decided that the game of the future is now poker.
Yes, that is perfect.
So when you emerge to compete, your world-class chess skills aren't just irrelevant. they actually become a massive liability.
Exactly, because you keep trying to apply the deterministic perfect information logic of chess to a game that's built entirely on hidden information and probability.
It's a complete mismatch.
It's a structural mismatch. And to really understand the mechanics of this collapse, we have to look at the core conflict inside the corporate boardrooms of Tokyo and Osaka.
Right. Take us inside those rooms. What were they thinking?
So in the late 80s and early 90s, the Japanese IT firms clearly saw the rising competitive threat from a newly energized Silicon Valley.
They weren't blind to it.
No, they saw it. And faced with that competition, they did what any rational, historically successful organization would do. They relied on their institutional memory, and they doubled down on their core competencies.
They leaned heavily into what made them the kings of the mountain in the first place.
Exactly, which was hardware precision, the legendary Japanese craftsmanship.
So they surveyed the competitive landscape and concluded, like, hey, our path to victory is simply to make the hardware smaller, faster, more reliable, and more physically perfect than ever before.
That was the fatal intuition, and the financial data the researchers uncovered regarding this response is just staggering.
What do the numbers look like?
To achieve this hyper-precision, Japanese firms massively increased their R&D budgets. I mean, they poured billions of yen into engineering laboratories to build better physical components.
Okay, but it didn't work.
No, it backfired. Instead of insulating them from the American threat, this massive financial effort actively accelerated their decline. The researchers meticulously mapped this out. Japan's global market share in IT plummeted concurrently with their rapidly rising R&D expenditures.
Wait, I really need to pause on that dynamic.
Yeah.
Because it fundamentally breaks how we usually think about business.
It really does.
Normally, we assume a direct correlation between investment and outcome.
Right.
Like you inject more capital into R&D, you invent better products, consumers buy more, market share grows.
That's the traditional linear model, yeah.
But this was a death spiral.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize the intellectual caliber of the people involved here. The executives and engineers guiding these massive corporations, they weren't foolish.
Not at all. They were some of the most brilliant, highly educated minds on the planet.
Right. They didn't lack intelligence. They lacked the context of a completely new world.
Well, they were operating under a historical framework where innovation was defined as a linear return on physical investment, meaning the established logic dictated that if you put $1 into hardware R&D, you eventually get $1.20 back in improved product sales, right? Because the consumer values that physical improvement.
Right. Better screen, better buttons, I pay more.
Exactly. But the paradigm, the fundamental underlying physics of the technology industry, had shifted so violently that traditional hardware R&D literally transformed into a negative asset.
A negative asset? You mean the simple act of trying to build the perfect physical machine was actively destroying the value of the company?
Yes. It implies that every dollar spent optimizing the hardware was a dollar that the market actively penalized them for spending.
Because the value proposition of the end product was no longer tethered to the physical perfection of the components.
Precisely. The researchers extensively document how Japanese hardware manufacturers faced these insurmountable challenges because they were optimizing a metric that the market was rapidly ceasing to value.
They were perfecting the physical container while the consumer was only interested in the digital content.
That's exactly it.
So if pouring mountains of capital into building better, faster hardware was suddenly a recipe for corporate suicide, we have to identify the mechanism that replaced it. Like, what was this invisible force pulling the rug out from under them?
The researchers define this shift with a very specific structural concept. They call it IT going soft.
Going soft.
Yeah. Starting subtly in the late 80s and then accelerating into an absolute explosion in the 90s, the primary trajectory of technological change became entirely dependent on software.
That phrase, going soft, it sounds deceptively simple.
It does, but the implications are profound.
Right, because we aren't merely talking about companies that explicitly sell software. Like, we're not just talking about Microsoft selling Windows or Adobe selling Photoshop.
No, we are talking about a fundamental change where even physical, tangible hardware devices began to rely on invisible code to function.
Differentiate themselves.
Yes, to capture consumer interest. And this was in no way a slow, manageable transition. It was a violent, systemic reorganization of the entire global technology industry.
The study points out that software became the primary driver of product functionality, across almost every category of electronics, right?
Oh, yeah. We are looking at mobile phones, DVD players, hard disk drives, telecommunications, routing equipment.
Even highly specialized industrial machinery.
Exactly. The engineering literature cited in the study reveals that the very architecture of hardware design became increasingly subordinated to software requirements.
It effectively means the soul of the machine suddenly mattered infinitely more than its body.
I like that, the soul over the body.
Yeah, like a Japanese manufacturer could build a perfectly engineered titanium box packed with the most flawless circuitry ever designed by human hands. But if the code running inside that box was clunky,
Or if the user interface was frustrating.
right, or if it couldn't seamlessly integrate with a broader software ecosystem, the consumer simply did not care about the titanium box.
The physical perfection was rendered entirely irrelevant by a poor digital experience.
The market had just fundamentally moved on.
It had. The study cites venture capitalists, industry observers, and engineering journals from the time, forcefully arguing that the central value proposition in the computer business had irrevocably shifted away from the hardware chassis and toward the systems and application software.
It became the golden dividing line of the era.
It was the fault line that permanently separated the winners from the losers in the 1990s.
I think the easiest way to internalize this shift, for you listening at home, is to consider the devices you use every single day.
Good point.
Think about a modern smartphone. When was the last time you walked into a store and bought a phone strictly because the glass screen was manufactured with a slightly higher tensile strength?
Or because the internal soldering is aesthetically pleasing. You don't.
You never do. You buy the device because of the operating system. You buy it for access to a specific app store.
For the computational photography software that automatically adjusts lighting after you take a picture.
Exactly. The seamless background integration with cloud storage. The physical phone has essentially been reduced to a vessel. The software ecosystem is the actual product you're buying.
And that exact realization, the transition from valuing the vessel to valuing the water inside, is what dismantled the Japanese hardware empire.
They were stubbornly selling the world's most pristine glass vessels to a global market that was dying of thirst.
That is a phenomenal way to put it. And the brilliance of this research paper is that Arora, Branstetter, and Drev didn't just hypothesize this narrative.
Right. They didn't just write an opinion piece.
No, they found a way to empirically, mathematically prove it by examining the very DNA of the innovations themselves. They went straight to the patent data.
Yes. The patent data methodology. This is where the paper really transitions from a historical retrospective into like a full-blown forensic investigation.
It really is.
Because they uncovered this hidden, staggering trend buried in the archives that they identified as the ghost code.
The ghost code, yeah. The methodology they employed is quite elegant.
Break it down for us.
So the researchers examined comprehensive granular data on all information technology patents granted by the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO.
Yeah.
Between the years 1980 and 2002, they were parsing through over 100,000 individual patents.
Wow.
And they were specifically hunting for a very particular pattern of cross-pollination. They wanted to see how often non-software IT patents...
Meaning patents filed for physical hardware components.
Right. How often those hardware patents were explicitly citing software patents.
Okay, so for anyone unfamiliar with the mechanics of intellectual property, when an inventor files a patent for a new creation, you're legally required to list prior patents that your new invention builds upon, right?
Yes, those are called citations. It acts as a genealogical tree for the invention.
So if someone invents a revolutionary new bicycle tire, their patent application must cite previous patents regarding rubber vulcanization or specific wheel rim designs that their new idea incorporates.
Exactly. So the researchers essentially looked at the blueprints for new hardware and asked, are these hardware inventors suddenly forced to rely on software to make their physical machines work?
And what did the historical record show?
It provided an overwhelming affirmative. The citation data shows massive exponential spikes.
Like how massive?
Well, they modeled the probability of these cross-citations, carefully controlling for the underlying fact that there were simply more software patents in existence as time went on, obviously.
Right, you have to account for that.
And even after stripping out those variables, the trend was undeniable. They found that by the year 2002, an IT hardware patent was almost 4 times more likely to cite a software patent than a comparable hardware patent filed just 10 years earlier in 1992.
Wait, a 400% increase in reliance on software in just a single decade?
Yes, it represents a silent, systemic takeover of the innovation process. Software was quietly but aggressively swallowing the soul of hardware innovation.
The ghost code.
Exactly. By the early 2000s, the structural DNA of a piece of newly invented hardware was fundamentally different than it was in the early 90s.
It was inextricably intertwined with code.
You couldn't conceive, design, or patent a physical component in isolation anymore. It had to be designed with a deep awareness of the software that would govern it.
Which brings us to the data point that truly illustrates the tragedy of the Japanese tech empire here. Because while the entire global hardware industry was actively merging its DNA with software, the Japanese R&D labs became an information island.
They really did. The researchers isolated the data and found that Japanese invented IT patents were a staggering 93% less likely to cite software patents than their non-Japanese peers in the exact same field.
93% less likely. That deficit is almost unfathomable when you consider the scale of these companies.
It's massive. What the data exposes is that while the rest of the industrialized world was aggressively combining hardware mechanics and software logic to build the infrastructure of the future, Japanese firms were completely institutionally isolated.
They were still churning out brilliant, highly complex hardware patents.
Dude, but those patents were trapped inside an obsolete hardware-only ecosystem.
Right. They were utilizing vast resources to invent things for a world that was rapidly ceasing to exist.
Exactly.
Now, if we look at the other side of the Pacific, it raises an obvious question about the American response. Because the U.S. wasn't exclusively a software nation in the 1980s.
No, not at all.
The U.S. had massive entrenched hardware companies too. Giants like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, they built physical things.
They definitely did.
So if Japan was missing the software boat so completely, how did the American hardware giants navigate this shift? Did they just magically intuit that they needed to start writing code alongside their manufacturing?
There was no magic involved. Instead, the American hardware firms executed a quiet, aggressive, and incredibly disruptive blood transfusion of their entire workforce.
A blood transfusion.
Yeah. The researchers utilized labor data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics to map exactly how these companies altered their internal chemistry.
This concept of a workforce blood transfusion is so essential to understand because it shows how quickly a corporate entity can change its nature if it isn't restricted by its own traditions.
Right, so the researchers scrutinized the occupational employment statistics within U.S. IT industries. If you isolate American companies that were officially legally classified under the umbrella of computer and peripheral equipment manufacturing.
Which means these are strictly physical hardware companies on paper.
Exactly. On paper, they make boxes. The share of their employee base that consisted of software engineers surged dramatically. Within a relatively short window, the proportion of software engineers at these hardware manufacturers grew from about 11% in 1999 to over 17% by 2007.
The irony there is so profound. These American legacy companies maintained their prestigious names, they kept their corporate classifications as hardware manufacturers, but behind the closed doors of their R&D facility.
They had secretly transformed themselves into software factories in disguise.
Yes. They were actively reducing their headcount of traditional hardware engineers and aggressively hiring software developers.
The American Executive Board saw the ghost code writing on the wall. They recognized that their world-class hardware was becoming commoditized and effectively useless without software differentiation.
So they just changed the raw human composition of the teams building the products.
They did.
Now, if we contrast that agile American workforce transition with the data coming out of Japan, the picture becomes incredibly bleak. Because Japan was applying for a literal mountain of non-software IT patents.
Oh, the volume was insane.
The paper includes this graphical representation showing that throughout the late 80s and early 90s, the average Japanese tech firm was actively outpacing the average U.S. firm in the sheer volume of IT hardware patents filed.
They were working feverishly.
But if you look at their software patents over that same period, the line representing Japanese software innovation essentially flatlines near zero.
Yeah, near zero.
It presents the illusion of massive innovation, like a fake fire generating incredible heat and light. But it was burning entirely the wrong fuel for the new economy.
The concept of a fake fire perfectly encapsulates their predicament. That intense, localized effort in hardware refinement was generating almost zero real market value.
Right. And observing this stark divergence naturally prompts a critical question for me. I mean, the global market is somewhat transparent, right? The products are on the shelves.
Right.
Didn't anyone within the leadership of these massive Japanese conglomerates look across the ocean at the United States and realize they were being outflanked? Like, why didn't a Sony or a Toshiba or a Fujitsu simply mandate the hiring of thousands of software engineers for their peripheral divisions to match the American strategy?
It seems like the most obvious corrective action in the world, doesn't it?
Totally. If your competitor is beating you because they integrated software into their hardware, you just pivot and hire your own software team.
Well, to comprehend why such a seemingly simple pivot was impossible for them, we first have to quantify the catastrophic financial consequences of their failure to do so.
Okay, let's get into the economics.
This leads us deep into the data, specifically to what the researchers expose as the Great Efficiency Collapse.
Ah, yes. The section of the paper detailing this collapse is just breathtaking in its scale. We are looking at a statistical breakdown of what is likely the worst collapse of research and development efficiency ever recorded in modern industrial history.
Let's examine the raw metrics. The researchers calculated the underlying productivity of R&D, essentially measuring how many valuable, highly cited patents a corporation produces for every $1 million they allocate to research.
So bang for your buck.
Exactly. During their golden era, from roughly 1983 to 1988, Japanese R&D was remarkably efficient. The data shows they were 40% more productive than American R&D during that window.
40%.
Boy.
They were extracting significantly more innovation from every single unit of capital deployed.
They were undisputed masters of capital allocation. They knew exactly how to turn money into valuable technology. But then, the researchers shift the window to the period from 1994 to 1999. And in that relatively short span, Japanese R&D efficiency suffered an absolute collapse. They plummeted from a 40% advantage to becoming 60% less productive than their counterparts in the U.S.
Wait, I need to make sure I heard that right. They went from outperforming America by 40% to underperforming America by 60%.
Yes.
That represents a 100-point negative swing in capital efficiency in roughly a decade.
It's unheard of.
It means the same Japanese engineers working in the exact same pristine labs suddenly found that their output was functionally worthless compared to what they were doing just a few years prior.
A 100-point swing is a catastrophic failure of capital allocation. And furthermore, the researchers discovered that this collapse was not distributed evenly across the entire Japanese technology sector.
Oh, really?
No, it was effectively a precision strike that devastated only the specific areas where software integration was becoming mandatory.
Right. The researchers segmented the analysis by specific industries to prove this, correct?
They categorized the data into 3 distinct technological sectors: basic electronics, semiconductors, and IT hardware.
Okay, so let's break those down. Basic electronics, such as traditional audiovisual equipment, is historically the least software intensive, right?
Correct. Semiconductors sit in the middle of the spectrum. And IT hardware, computers, networking gear, peripherals is the most heavily reliant on software integration.
Got it.
So in the low software field of basic electronics, Japan's efficiency actually held steady. They maintained relative parity with the U.S. for a considerable time.
Which makes sense because in the mid-1990s, basic consumer electronics didn't require millions of lines of code. Like a high-end stereo receiver is fundamentally just an amplifier and a radio tuner.
Exactly. The physical engineering was still the primary value driver there.
Okay, so the data totally backs that up.
Yeah.
But what about the high software fields?
When we look at the high software fields, semiconductors, and IT hardware, Japan's efficiency advantage evaporated seemingly overnight. The precise sectors that required the deepest integration of software architecture experienced the most catastrophic drops in Japanese R&D productivity.
Wow.
This sector-specific collapse mathematically proves that the transition to software was the specific pathogen that destroyed their productivity.
And what makes this even more compelling to me is that the global financial markets recognized this pathogen before the corporate executives did.
Oh, the markets always know.
Right. The stock market is an incredibly ruthless, highly efficient pricing mechanism. And it figured out that Japanese R&D was dying in real time. The paper utilizes a very specific economic metric to illustrate this, called Tobin's Q.
Tobin's Q. It's a foundational economic ratio. At its most basic level, it measures the overall market value of a firm, the total price the stock market assigns to the company, divided by the replacement cost of its tangible physical assets, like its factories, its real estate, its inventory, and its cash reserves.
Okay, so if a company boasts a high Tobin's Q, it indicates that the financial markets are placing a massive premium on their intangible assets.
Exactly. It means investors highly value their intellectual property, their patents, their R&D pipeline, and their future capacity for innovation.
So if I'm understanding Tobin's Q correctly, it's essentially the stock market's way of shouting, "We believe the ideas inside your engineers' heads are worth exponentially more than the physical buildings they work in."
That is the perfect translation. And during the 1980s, Japanese IT firms commanded a massive Tobin's Q premium over U.S. firms. Global capital markets absolutely loved Japanese R&D.
But as we move through the 1990s,
The researchers map out a devastating visual on the charts, something we might call a century cross.
a century cross.
The valuation lines intersect and violently reverse course. The valuations of U.S. firms skyrocketed into the stratosphere, heavily fueled by market enthusiasm for their software-driven R&D, while Japanese valuations plummeted into a deep abyss.
It was capital punishment on a global scale. The researchers actually use a phenomenal term to describe this phenomenon: the shadow price of R&D.
Yes, the shadow price. They analyzed how the market priced $1 of research. For an American tech firm in the late 90s, every single dollar they allocated to R&D generated a massive premium in their overall stock valuation.
The market looked at American R&D spending and basically said, yes, we see that you're building software ecosystems. This is clearly the future. Here are billions of dollars in added valuation.
Exactly. But for a Japanese firm, the market analyzed their ledgers, saw them spending billions on physical hardware R&D, and valued that spending at near zero.
Zero.
The market was effectively sending a clear signal. We see you deploying massive capital to perfect the hardware, and we consider that capital completely incinerated.
Man, the global capital markets had already prejudged their hardware-obsessed strategy as a terminal failure long before the products even hit the shelves.
They recognized that Japanese R&D had morphed into a negative asset before the Japanese executives even realized their strategy was flawed.
But, I want to pause here and address a major counter-argument.
Sure.
Because anyone familiar with modern economic history knows that a massive systemic event occurred in Japan right at this exact time. The legendary Japanese economic bubble spectacularly burst in 1989.
Right, the lost decades.
Exactly. The Nikkei stock index crashed, real estate values collapsed, and it triggered a historic multi-decade macroeconomic recession. So, playing the skeptic here isn't the answer obvious.
You're going to say it was just the bubble?
Yeah. The Japanese tech sector didn't die because of some invisible software shift. It died because their entire domestic economy blew up. They simply ran out of money. It was just a standard macroeconomic recession, wasn't it?
It is arguably the most common excuse cited for their decline. But the researchers completely dismantle this myth using fundamental economic logic.
How so?
Consider the mechanics of corporate budgeting. If a severe macroeconomic recession forces a company to aggressively slash its operating budget, what specific projects do they cut first?
Well, you immediately cut the fat. You eliminate the highly experimental, high-risk, marginal research projects. You protect your core, most profitable, most guaranteed research and development at all costs.
Exactly. You inevitably cut your worst, least productive projects. Therefore, mathematically, your overall R&D efficiency, the ratio of valuable cited patents you produce per dollar you are still able to spend, should logically go up during a recession.
Oh.
Because you are only funding the absolute best, most rigorously vetted ideas. But as the researchers' data clearly established, Japan's efficiency didn't rise. It fell off a cliff.
That is a phenomenal deduction. If their decline was purely a budget issue caused by a recession, they would have emerged leaner and meaner.
Exactly.
They would have produced fewer total patents, perhaps, but the patents they did produce would have been incredibly high quality. Instead, they were actually getting remarkably worse at inventing things for every dollar they spent.
The bubble bursting simply cannot explain the mathematical collapse in efficiency. And furthermore, a macroeconomic recession cannot explain why the efficiency collapse was so uniquely concentrated in the software-intensive sectors, while their basic electronics R&D efficiency remains stable during the exact same economic crisis.
A national recession does not selectively target software-heavy research labs.
No, it doesn't. A paradigm shift does.
Wow. Okay, that brings up another massive excuse people frequently use to explain this era. The argument that America simply had an unfair, insurmountable advantage because the Silicon Valley venture capital ecosystem, or because massive monopolies like Microsoft essentially rigged the global game by controlling the PC standard.
The monopoly argument, right.
The argument is basically Japan didn't fail at innovation. Microsoft just monopolized the operating system, and venture capitalists bought up everything else.
The researchers thoroughly anticipated that exact defense, and their methodological proof against it is incredibly robust.
What did they do?
To test this theory, they literally stripped all venture capital-backed startups out of the United States dataset.
Just remove them entirely.
Entirely. Furthermore, they entirely removed the standard owners, the massive dominant monopolies like Microsoft and Intel, from the data pool. Microsoft is completely absent from the final analysis.
Wait, they intentionally handicapped the American data by removing the most famous success stories of the 90s?
Yeah.
And then reran the entire analysis.
They did. And even after removing the VC ecosystem and the major monopolies, the massive efficiency gap between the U.S. and Japan remained perfectly intact.
That is wild.
The data conclusively proves that the U.S. resurgence and the Japanese collapse were not anomalies driven by a handful of monopolistic players or a swarm of heavily funded startups. It was a broad-based systemic advantage held by the established legacy American hardware firms that had successfully managed to pivot their internal structure towards software.
So if we eliminate the bursting economic bubble, and we eliminate Microsoft and the VC ecosystem as the primary culprits, we are forced back to my earlier question. If it was so clear that software was the future, why did the massive Japanese conglomerates just pivot? Why did they just hire an army of programmers?
Right.
This brings us to what I consider the most devastating realization in the entire study, the fatal shackle.
The fatal shackle.
Yeah.
It fundamentally was not just a lack of corporate willpower or a failure of executive imagination. Japan faced a devastating, immutable physical bottleneck.
Physical bottleneck.
Yes. To win a war fought with software, you require an army of coders. You need massive amounts of human fuel. And Japan, demographically and structurally, simply did not have them.
It essentially boils down to basic logistics. You cannot build a software empire if you physically lack software engineers.
Right.
However, the United States didn't actually have enough native-born software engineers graduating from his own universities to pull this off either. I mean, the American education system couldn't keep up with the demand.
It couldn't.
But America utilized a completely unprecedented mechanism to bypass their own physical limitations. They activated a global cheat code.
The study meticulously details how the United States effectively bypassed the physical limits of its domestic talent pool through aggressive immigration policy and rapid globalization.
The labor data here is just striking.
It really is. Between the years 1995 and 2001, the inflow of new IT talent into the United States skyrocketed from approximately 75,000 individuals a year to over 165,000 annually.
And the obvious question is, where was this massive influx of talent coming from? Because as we noted, U.S. universities weren't suddenly graduating double or triple the number of computer science majors overnight. The domestic pipeline was largely static.
A massive, disproportionate share of this talent surge was fueled by the H-1B visa program.
The H-1B hack.
The United States recognized a critical labor shortage and actively imported highly skilled foreign IT workers to fill the void. In fact, the researchers note that during the latter years of this sample period, America was importing more IT specialists from abroad in a single year than its entire domestic university system was graduating across all IT-related bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs combined.
They were quite literally airlifting in an entirely new workforce to fight the software war. Now, I want to be really clear here. For you listening, we need to clarify our perspective.
Yes, definitely.
We are analyzing this phenomenon purely through the lens of economic data and labor supply mechanisms as presented in this specific NBER study.
Right.
We are not evaluating the political or social dimensions of immigration policy. The study objectively reports this as a raw economic reality. The U.S. tech sector faced a massive demand shock for human capital to execute the software shift, and it aggressively utilized immigration visas as the primary mechanism to satisfy that demand.
It was functionally a mechanism of global brain arbitrage.
Brain arbitrage.
The United States tapped into the global talent pool to solve a local labor shortage. And to truly grasp the impact of this mechanism, you simply have to look at the corresponding labor graph for Japan.
What does their graph look like?
During that exact same critical window, 1995 to 2001, when the U.S. talent inflow was rocketing vertically to 165,000 a year, Japan's new talent inflow line was an incredibly depressing, flat horizontal line.
Just flat.
It barely registers any movement. Japan's highly restrictive immigration policies, compounded by severe language barriers, completely prevented them from importing the international talent they desperately required to pivot their industries.
The analogy that comes to mind is that America realized they were running out of local soldiers to fight this entirely new kind of software war. So they utilized their capital to hire a massive, highly skilled international mercenary army.
Yeah.
Japan, however, attempted to fight World War III using only the local hometown militia they had available. It becomes a pure numbers game, and Japan had lost the war of attrition before they even took the field.
And the labor disparity extended far beyond immigration. It also encompassed the massive rise of offshore outsourcing.
The offshore empire.
The researchers detail the emergence of the Indian offshore software empire. By the year 2001, the United States was already outsourcing complex software development to over 120,000 programmers based in India.
Over 120,000 developers working in India, writing the invisible code that would power U.S. hardware and U.S. networks. And what was Japan's utilization of that same offshore resource?
By 2005, a full 4 years later, Japan was only utilizing approximately 15,000 offshore programmers.
120K versus 15K.
So when you combine the domestic influx from H-1B visas with the massive scale of Indian offshore outsourcing, the U.S. had assembled a talent pool advantage that was exponentially larger than anything Japan could field.
Now, I can easily imagine a skeptic hearing these numbers and arguing, like, all right, America had hundreds of thousands of imported coders and offshore workers typing away. But are raw numbers really what drives innovation? Were these hundreds of thousands of developers really the genius visionaries inventing the future? Does having more average programmers really beat having a few brilliant Japanese engineers?
That is a phenomenal question. And it transitions us to a fascinating economic framework the researchers included in the appendix of their paper.
Okay, let's hear it.
It explores the multiplier effect of labor and the critical structural difference between what they term architects and code warriors.
Architects and code warriors. I want to spend some time breaking this model down because it perfectly explains how raw quantities of average programmers can mathematically translate into world-dominating breakthrough innovation.
Absolutely. In the realm of software development, there is a distinct hierarchy of skills and tasks. At the apex, you have the architects.
Okay.
These are the rare, highly skilled, genius-level innovators. They are the individuals who conceptualize the entire system architecture, who design the breakthrough algorithms, who possess the vision to see how novel software can revolutionize a piece of hardware.
These are your generational talents.
Yeah.
The visionaries whose names usually end up on the actual patents.
Exactly. However, a genius architect is almost completely useless if they're sitting alone in a room. To actually build the complex system they envision, to write the millions of lines of routine code, to rigorously test every module for bugs, to maintain the legacy systems, you require a massive foundational layer of less skilled, more standard programmers.
Code warriors.
The researchers categorize this essential baseline workforce as the code warriors.
So the code warriors are essentially the infantry of the software world. They do the grinding, essential labor that makes the vision an actual reality.
Yes. And the economic model the researchers built demonstrates that these two groups are not just related, they are synergistic complements.
How so?
An architect's inherent productivity is mathematically multiplied by the sheer number of code warriors they have at their disposal.
Oh, okay.
The more code warriors you have typing out the routine scripts and executing the quality assurance testing, the more time the architect has freed up to actually do what they do best, design the next breakthrough innovation.
So if we apply this to a real-world scenario, an architect in Silicon Valley designs a brilliant new operating system architecture. Instead of coding it all herself, she hands the blueprints off to an army of 500 code warriors.
Many of whom might be H-1B visa holders or offshore developers in Bangalore.
Right, and they actually physically build and test the system in 6 months. The architect, meanwhile, immediately moves on to designing her next brilliant idea. Her output is multiplied exponentially.
That is the precise mechanism of U.S. dominance. Now, take that exact same economic model and apply it to Japan.
Okay.
Japan possessed brilliant people. They had world-class, genius-level software architects within their ranks. But because they entirely lacked that massive foundational layer of accessible code warriors, their top-tier architects were completely suffocated by routine labor.
Oh, the implications of that are tragic. They effectively had 4-star generals doing the daily labor of frontline privates.
The Japanese software geniuses were forced to spend the majority of their time doing the grueling grunt work themselves. They're writing routine integration code, running basic diagnostic tests and maintaining outdated legacy systems.
Their capacity for high-level innovation was effectively strangled.
They couldn't possibly innovate at the speed of the global market because they were permanently bogged down in the trenches of daily maintenance.
It is a devastating misallocation of human capital. I mean, it would be like employing Albert Einstein, but mandating that he spend 90% of his day sharpening pencils, answering phones, and organizing the filing cabinets.
He's not going to discover the theory of relativity doing that.
It's a mathematical certainty that he isn't. The U.S. utilization of global brain arbitrage didn't just provide them with more total workers. It fundamentally unlocked the full creative potential of their top-tier innovators.
It constituted a devastating structural disadvantage for Japan. However, the researchers make a crucial point here.
What's that?
The macroeconomic labor shortage was only half of the cage that trapped the Japanese tech empire. The other half was an institutional cage, one built entirely by their own highly celebrated corporate culture.
This is where the internal politics of these companies become the primary antagonist, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because even if Japan couldn't easily import 100,000 foreign coders, these were massive, immensely wealthy multinational corporations. Sony, Toshiba, Hitachi, they possessed billions of dollars in capital.
Massive capital.
So why did they just forcefully pivot their internal culture? Why didn't the executive board simply mandate an aggressive internal shift toward software development, retraining their existing staff?
Because the very cultural pillars that made Japanese corporate culture famous, the specific practices that were aggressively studied and envied by American business schools throughout the 1980s, transformed into a deadly poison during a time of rapid technological paradigm shift.
I think we really need to carefully unpack this poison of tradition.
Let's do it.
On the surface, the concept of lifetime employment shushinkoyo sounds like an incredibly humane, positive system for the worker. You secure a position at a Japanese tech giant straight out of university, and you are effectively guaranteed stability and employment for the duration of your career.
It is an exceptional system for fostering loyalty and stability during periods of slow, incremental technological progress. But it is absolutely catastrophic for corporate agility during a violent paradigm shift.
Because you can't adapt.
Exactly. When the foundational technology of the industry shifted from hardware to software, American companies possessed the brutal flexibility to simply fire large swaths of their traditional hardware engineers and immediately hire software engineers in their place.
Right. It is a harsh reality for the workers, but it allows the corporation to pivot instantly.
Japanese companies, constrained by both rigid labor laws and profound cultural expectations, absolutely could not execute that kind of workforce replacement. They were permanently locked into their existing human capital.
So the Japanese conglomerates are sitting there with payrolls bloated by thousands of world-class mechanical engineers, material scientists, and optical specialists, and they cannot legally or culturally dismiss them.
They're stuck.
And you cannot realistically take a 50-year-old master of optical lens manufacturing and send them to a 6-week seminar to turn them into a world-class C++ software architect. It's impossible.
The immobility of the workforce was paralyzing. And the problem compounded exponentially when you look at the executive leadership.
The bosses.
Right. Because of the strict system of internal promotion based on tenure and seniority, the executives occupying the boardrooms in the late 1990s were the exact same individuals who had successfully built the hardware empire in the 1970s and 80s.
The hardware bosses. The men who built the titanium boxes.
They were hardware purists to their very core. Their entire worldview, their metrics for success, and their personal career legacies were entirely based on achieving physical manufacturing perfection.
They fundamentally did not comprehend the abstract, iterative logic of software development.
The study cites compelling evidence that these entrenched hardware executives often actively suppressed the software divisions within their own companies.
Suppress them.
They viewed software not as the future, but as an irritating necessary evil, like a subordinate feature merely required to make their beautiful hardware function, rather than the core engine of consumer value.
They were actively sabotaging their own corporate survival because the new paradigm threatened the historical kingdom they had spent their lives building.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the innovator's dilemma, amplified by cultural rigidity.
But I can easily anticipate a skeptic out there listening to all of this and concluding Perhaps the macroeconomic data and the cultural explanations are overcomplicating things. Maybe the Japanese workforce simply have a cultural or educational blind spot for software. Maybe their language structure or their university system just doesn't produce minds optimized for writing code.
The researchers clearly anticipated that exact cultural bias argument, and they delivered what I consider to be the ironclad, irrefutable proof that it is entirely false.
Yes, the ironclad proof.
To disprove it, they examined a phenomenon we can categorize as the split personality of the Japanese tech giants.
The split personality data is the absolute smoking gun of the entire research paper. I want you to walk us through exactly how they isolated this variable.
The researchers zeroed in on the patents filed by these massive Japanese multinational corporations. Let's use a hypothetical giant like a Sony or a Hitachi as a mental placeholder.
Okay.
They meticulously separated the patents that these companies invented inside their primary research labs located physically in Japan from the patents that these exact same companies invented in their satellite research labs located physically in the United States.
Wait, so we are looking at the exact same corporate entity, the same logo on the building, the same ultimate CEO in Tokyo, the same corporate funding. The only variable changing is the geographic location of the specific R&D lab.
Precisely. If the underlying problem was simply that Japanese companies are inherently bad at software, or that their corporate DNA was incompatible with code, then the technological output should be identical regardless of where the lab is located.
Because it's the same company.
Right. But the data revealed a shocking split personality. For the patents filed by Japanese companies originating from their home labs physically located inside Japan, a mere 6% were software patents.
6%. That is effectively a statistical vacuum. It shows they were doing almost zero software innovation at home.
However, when the researchers analyzed the patents filed by the American branches of those exact same Japanese companies, the labs located in California or elsewhere in the U.S., the software patent share was 33%.
A jump from 6% to 33%. That is a staggering disparity within the same company.
It stands as the ultimate empirical proof of the researcher's thesis. It conclusively proves that it wasn't the Japanese people who were incapable of writing software, and it wasn't the company name or the overarching corporate charter that was the inherent problem.
It was the environment.
Yes. When Japanese firms operated outside the institutional cage of their home islands, when they established labs in the U.S., where they could freely hire from that global mercenary army of code warriors.
Where they weren't shackled by the cultural traditions of lifetime employment.
Where they were totally immersed in a software-centric ecosystem, they successfully innovated in software just like their American competitors.
The cage was entirely geographic and institutional. The rigid legal and cultural environment on the Japanese home islands literally locked them out of the future. The stubbornness of the hardware bosses, combined with the physical lack of a fluid talent pipeline, just choked the life out of their empire from the inside.
Which leads us to the grand sweeping conclusion of this extensive autopsy.
Let's bring it all together.
The Japanese IT empire, the terror of the 1980s, wasn't defeated by a superior American hardware manufacturer building a fundamentally better television or a faster memory chip.
They weren't beaten at their own game.
No. They were defeated by an invisible gravity. They were undone by a silent, systemic shift to a software paradigm that their executives couldn't comprehend, a global brain arbitrage of labor that their borders couldn't accommodate, and a rigid institutional cage of their own making that they couldn't break out of.
It really serves as a profound historical lesson regarding the latent danger of overwhelming success. The very attributes that made Japan so utterly dominant in the 1980s, their meticulous, highly optimized hardware R&D, the incredible stability of their lifetime employment system, their homogeneous and deeply loyal corporate culture, metastasized into the exact mechanisms of their destruction in the 1990s.
It brings us full circle to the paradox we started with. Absolute success today can literally engineer your failure tomorrow if the underlying gravity of your industry shifts.
Like if you spend your life becoming the perfect chess player and the world decides to play poker, your flawless chess opening is the exact thing that will leave you bankrupt at the table.
Which leaves us with a final, chilling warning to consider, drawn straight from the modern implications of this text.
I want you all to really think about this.
Think about the technological paradigm shifts occurring right now, at this very moment. Consider the explosive, capital-intensive rise of artificial intelligence and the incredibly fierce new geopolitical battles over advanced semiconductor manufacturing and data center infrastructure.
Right, because we are currently watching the world's largest companies pour hundreds of billions of dollars into building physical AI infrastructure. It's like the new hardware arms race.
The researchers who offered the study issued a clear warning that any nation or any massive corporation that fails to comprehend the evolving infrastructure of innovation or chooses to lock its doors and restrict the fluid movement of global talent is effectively doomed to repeat this exact cycle of collapse.
Huh.
So, the provocative question we must ask ourselves today is this. Are we currently watching another Japan unfold in real time?
Are there modern technological empires operating right now, stubbornly spending billions to build perfect, ultimately obsolete infrastructure, completely blind to the fact that the invisible gravity of the future has already shifted beneath their feet?
It's entirely possible.
That is a thought that should keep any tech executive or policymaker awake at night. The next great empire might already be falling, and they won't even realize they've lost until the next ghost code takes over the market. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden currents of technological history. We'll see you next time.